The title of my talk is The Great American Freefall. And what I'd like to try to do is to use geographic analysis to help explore the sets of circumstances that we find ourselves in as a potential pathway to identify a forward motion in the future. In 2003, I was hired by the Ford Foundation to re-examine poverty policy in the United States. That project led to a series of tools, an atlas, and a great deal of insight about the success of American poverty policy. Looking back in 1959 to 1966, you can see that national poverty rates were, for different groups in society, extraordinarily high. And it was identified at that time as one of the nation's most pressing concerns. Over the course of 3 decades, we made tremendous progress in reducing the poverty rate from what it was in 1959, 22%, to 1969 at 12.2%. At the same time, that poverty rate has been stubborn in its unchangeability in the subsequent years. And it led President Ronald Reagan in 1987 to suggest that despite all the money that we put into poverty policy and to reconstruct communities and to build better lives for people, that we had waged a war on poverty and poverty had won. But that's not actually what happened. There was a tremendous decline in poverty, and there was fabulous opportunities that were created for many people in society. Not everyone, but for many people. But what's happened is, over the last 30 years, the poverty rate's gotten stuck between 12 and 15%. And the question is why? And that's a part of the story of the sense of ill-ease that people have today, which is it doesn't seem like we're making progress anymore. Here's a map just to suggest, if I was to show you a map of 1959, it would have shades that would look quite similar to this, and that's because the geography of poverty has basically stayed quite similar. The Northeast has always had a lower poverty rate. The Midwest has had a variable poverty rate, but also lower. Where we really see significant poverty in the United States, which continues today, is in the southern region, Native American lands, natural resource lands, and some of the agricultural areas of California. So this is the picture that we see today, and this is a backdrop for a portion of our society in terms of what their life experience is. But how is it that we actually got from the 22% to the 15%? There's a notion in the United States that everybody deserves a chance, but you're also supposed to make it on your own. And Americans are incredibly resourceful when it comes to living up to that expectation. We are a society that has often said to one another, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps when you get into a difficult situation. Don't feel a sense of remorse or that there's no change possible. It's up to you to do that. And that's been a very powerful force in the American psyche from the very beginning. Americans crossed the country in the early stages of the country's development because they knew that there was opportunity beyond the existing settlements. Why did people cross the plains? Because there were agricultural lands that could be inhabited. And we've done that we've used geographic mobility as a way of creating economic opportunity for us, and it has been a very successful experience. Americans are also very hardworking, and despite the economic recession of 2007, 2009, as you can see, Americans have a very high rate of employment, and even though we had a downturn, we were able to recover, and we have some of the lowest unemployment rates that we've seen in many decades. But with that said, there are still many Americans who are not working. So in the United States, we define labor force participation as those who are employed, those who are unemployed, and those who are looking for work. And the labor force participation rates have been extremely high at different moments in time. Today, our labor force participation rates are lower than we would expect given the growth rates that we have seen in the economy. The question is, why are people not participating in the labor force? And the answer is, they're discouraged. And they're discouraged because over the last 45 years, wage rates have been static, and in some cases, and for some people, they've actually declined. And it does not seem like the middle class possibility is there for everyone. And that's also one of those profound concepts that are embedded in us, is that if we work hard and we play by the rules, that we too will be able to be a member of the middle class. But that's changed over the last 5 decades. Every day in America, thousands of people, after a full day of work, go home and they have not made a wage that will pay their bills at the end of the month. We basically have had static incomes, and we also have a set of other issues associated with the actual compensation that people receive for the work that they do. The system is broken in a certain way. It used to be that as productivity went up, workers experienced some benefits from that change. But increasingly today, the relationship between productivity increases and wage rates has fallen off. Now, in terms of Americans and their aspirations for the middle class, it's important to recognize that the middle class income may not, in fact, be enough to cover your cost of living. How can that be? It's because the different components in the cost of living run on different economic cycles, so that you can be living in a place such as Boston, as an example, where the housing market is extremely constrained, and so rent prices go up significantly beyond what people's average incomes are. And then we could look at other things that we use on a regular basis as members of a consuming society, such as childcare, which is an added cost that is also in short supply and also very expensive. And it's expensive relative pretty much to anywhere, but it's also very expensive in metropolitan areas or places where there's a dynamic economy. So this graphic was developed by the Pew Charitable Trust. And what they wanted to do, and they have been tracking basically since the election, the progress that America is making on an income and economic security basis. And they developed an ability to calculate what would be the income levels by size of family that would constitute low, medium, and upper income. And so the area that I'm most interested in is the actual middle income range. Why Americans are despondent is in part revealed in this graphic. So you can see in 1971, 61% of Americans were deemed to be living in, with a middle-class income. And here we are today in 2016, and we see that there's been a drop of almost 10 full percentage points. What does that mean for the average household? It means that it's increasingly difficult for people to cover their basic costs. There is a need today for a living wage that actually is calculated on the actual cost of living in different places for different size families. Right now in the United States, the only mechanism we have that people are widely familiar with that describes to them what a wage rate should be is what we call the minimum wage. In 2003, when I did the research for the Ford Foundation, I built something called a living wage calculator, and I've been operating it since that time. And what it has done is it tracks the cost of living in different locations around the country, and it allows people to use it to gauge their relative prosperity, and sometimes they use it to change jobs, employers use it to set wages, policymakers use it to also set wages as a way of encouraging more stable employment. The tool is used by thousands of people, and I get emails every day from individuals and organizations about the actual tool and how it can be used, and in some cases they actually adopt it as their policy. So what does it do? What it does is it basically takes a series of household sizes and a basket of goods that people need, and it calculates using data from national, state, and local levels to come up with a composite wage rate. First it's an income, and then we calculate it into a wage rate that is approximate in, it provides a perspective on what people would need to cover their basic costs. So you can see here, we make a comparison, the living wage, the poverty wage, and the minimum wage, to give a sense for what is the difference between the tools that we traditionally use, such as the minimum wage, and what the actual living wage is. And so this is for Barnstable County, where we are. And what you can see is that the living wage and the minimum wage diverge. And that divergence is a gap, and if your costs are based on the surrounding environment and you're only able to get a job with a minimum wage, you can see that a gap will open in your income stream over time. So this is the breakdown of the elements of the tool. It's very simple. It can be reverse engineered if you're interested. But what you can see is that people spend at least 21% of their income on housing, 19 or 20% on child care, transportation is 19 or 20%, food, health, and others. And combined, that produces an annual income. So here you can see what the components are for an individual, and then you can read across and you can identify your family structure. And what we do is we often make comparisons between what we see at a local level and what we know people are earning. Now, the minimum wage is in many ways a great adversary to better income levels for Americans. And the reason is because it's being misused compared to when it was originally created. And what I mean by misuse is it was never meant to be a minimum wage. It was meant to be a wage upon which people could actually have a life more than bare subsistence. So this is Franklin Roosevelt's statement, which he said when he created the minimum wage. I laid down the simple proposition that nobody is going to starve in this country. It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends on existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. Now that's a pretty profound statement, but it is the case that the wage rate is set inside of the business. And as a consequence, if the business person doesn't know that there is a cost issue associated with living where they happen to operate, they can use the minimum wage almost just reflexively, rather than really thinking it through. And I say that because I work with businesses who ask me to help them make the difference between the minimum wage, which they offer, and the living wage, which they would like to provide. So what we can see here on this graph is, why is the minimum wage a challenge to American workers? Between 1940 and 2016, this is adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage has only doubled. But the cost of living has quadrupled. So people are simply unable to put those two things together and make it work. So here in Barnstable County, for example, over 33,000 households in Barnstable don't make a living wage. The living wage for Barnstable is $15.84, the minimum wage is $11, so you can see what the gap is. So what do families do when you have a gap? Well, we can see that national consumer debt is going up dramatically. We also know that people make choices between paying bills. We also know that people make choices between what they eat, their prescription drugs, and the kinds of recreational activities that they have. So that's a way for people to put a life together, but that produces a level of uncertainty because you feel like you're in free fall. You don't know what's going to happen next. Even middle-class families in Barnstable struggle. The $11 to $29 an hour minimum household income to be in the middle class is $46.99.58, but the amount of money that the household needs in order to cover its living costs is $65,887. So they may think they're in the middle class, or if you look at the middle class income, you would say, well, they're in middle class, but in fact, their cost of living greatly outstrips that income, and a gap emerges. So this is a picture of the United States and the difference between the living wage and the minimum wage by county in 2018. And the darker the color, the green color indicates the larger gap, and the purple color indicates the smaller gap. And you can see there's tremendous variety across the country in terms of the income gap that exists. In some metropolitan areas, the income gap is extreme over the course of a year. So if you think about it, you look at Fresno, California, and the gap is $4,000. If you look at Laredo, Texas, the gap is $9,000. And why those two places matter is because they predominantly have economic activities that are minimum wage. So why do we have this? Why is this happening? It's because there's these changes that are taking place in the labor market in which we are increasingly generating new jobs that do not pay a living wage. It simply is the case that when you go from a production economy to a service or consumption economy, wage rates are lower. And if you can see right here, these are the largest occupations in the United States. These are jobs where people are paid basically the minimum wage. Another issue is the role of franchises. Franchises are a very important part of our economy. These are organizations where there is a parent, and there's franchisees, and the franchisees buy goods from the parent, and the parent specifies sets of conditions for the franchise to operate. The one valve that the franchisor has to adjust for cost differences is wage rates. So franchises pay very low wages in the country, and they're a large portion of employment for people who are at the low income end. So what this basically says is the percent of franchise employees earning a living wage by county. And the purple color is indicating less than 10%, and the dark green color is indicating 75% or more. The point of the map is people that work in a franchised operation are very unlikely to make a living wage. We've calculated the difference between the living wage and the necessary public social service subsidies that families who have an adult working in a franchise needs in order to cover their living costs. And what we see here is a very high proportion of people who work in franchises actually have to get earned income credit, housing subsidies, food stamps, et cetera, in order to make up the gaps. And this is the actual hourly gap that results. Everything, so the purple is less than 25 cents, and the green is more than $2. So what that means is we're subsidizing low-income workers by their ability to use public programs in order to make something toward a living wage. What do we need to do? We need to make work pay. For a long time, since the 1970s really, incomes have been flat. No matter what people are doing, incomes are not rising except at the very high end. And until we make work pay, we're going to have a deficit, and we're going to have people who are not making a living wage. And there are places around the country that are using their capacity to formulate local policy to make these adjustments, and these are just a few where we see that. Massachusetts is one that has a higher wage. The second is income inequality in the United States is higher than it's ever been before. As long as that exists, as more incomes moves up to the higher income categories and there's less available for others, we're going to end in a situation where we are going to have a gap between the living wage and people's ability to make it on their own. And this is a map just simply to show where the greatest inequalities in the United States reside. Why does this matter? Because we've just gone through a period of great tumult in our country, and a lot of it is about economic insecurity. It was one thing when you didn't make when you could make your way on a minimum wage and have the expectation that you could make it into the middle class. But as that opportunity has declined, it has created a despondency in the public, which we have to reconcile if we want to pull the society back together again. Thank you.